I am 34 years old and I am a statistic. That's what I sometimes call myself. If someone walked past me on the street, they probably wouldn't remember my face unless they accidentally bumped into me in a cafe and noticed me dropping a cup on the floor. Average height, average weight, chestnut hair that stubbornly refuses to hold a curl. Eyes? Let's say they are the color of a pond on a bad day. Dark, murky, and, as I always suspected, too honest. I wasn't living. I was existing. It's hard to call it living when you spend day after day trying not to be noticed. But it was just a Tuesday. An ordinary Tuesday that was never supposed to become anything more. "Max, stop chasing your tail," I said, standing on the back porch and watching my golden retriever. He didn't listen. His tail, his sworn enemy, was the object of all his passions at that moment, while I, as usual, looked at the fence separating my small plot from the forest. That fence, it had become a kind of boundary of my world. It was a wall for me, a border that I could not cross for 7 years. On the other side, the trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper, and the air heavier. I didn't hate the forest, but it hated me. Max, as always, was indifferent to my fears. Wagging his tail, he ran up to me and nudged my palm with his nose. His brown eyes looked at me in a way no one else ever had, as if I were the center of his universe. I smirked, running my hand through his soft fur. "You have no idea what's there, do you?" I muttered, looking at the line where the fence turned into a wall of forest. "You wouldn't understand why this place is hell for me." Max raised his head as if he sensed my anxiety. I involuntarily smiled. He always knew when something was wrong. But the next moment, he dashed off. I didn't even have time to react. 1 second, he was by my side, wagging his tail, and the next, he had jumped over the fence. Just like that. The golden blur disappeared among the trees as if it had never been there. "Max!" I screamed. My heart stopped and then began to beat so hard it felt like it could be heard all around. But he didn't come back. "Max, come back." My voice echoed among the trees beyond the fence, but the only response was silence. My fingers gripped the edge of the fence so tightly that the wood dug into my palms. This couldn't be happening. This was just a coincidence. He would return in a minute, run back as always with that silly, adorable smile, and I would be able to breathe again. But the seconds dragged on. The minute turned into 2, and Max was still nowhere to be seen. "Max!" I shouted again, my voice breaking. The forest, which had once been familiar to me, now seemed hostile and frightening. I looked at it the way a person looks at their worst mistake. Max didn't know what he had done, but he made me look at that dark line of trees again. It wasn't just a wall of branches and shadows. It was my barrier, my end of the world. But what struck me was that I couldn't move. My feet seemed rooted to the ground. I knew I had to go after him, but every cell in my body screamed to stop. Then a voice sounded in my head. Not mine, but another one. Clear, stubborn, and I knew who it belonged to. "You always do this, Carla. You run." Sophie's voice sounded like the creak of an old recording. I heard her as if she were standing right behind me. "Maybe this time you'll try something different." "You're not here," I whispered, shaking my head, trying to chase away her image. "You're dead. It was an accident." My words hung in the air like a dead silence. I knew I was saying this to myself, but believing it was still hard. Sophie was my reminder of why I swore never to cross that fence. She is no longer here because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't brave enough. "Max, come back," I screamed again, this time with a note of desperation. But nothing happened. And then I heard a sound. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me shudder. The rustling of leaves, a faint sound as if something was moving among the trees. "Max?" I listened, not believing my ears, but the sound disappeared. I swallowed and turned to the fence. My hand reached for the top rail but paused. "Are you going to do this?" Sophie's voice sounded again. "Or maybe you'll wait 7 years like last time?" Let's see how far he can run. Stop, I whispered, feeling anger mixed with fear. It's not like that. But deep down, I knew the truth. Max was on the other side of the fence, and I had to go. No one else would do it for me. Not this time. With effort, I lifted my leg and swung it over the top rail. My heart was pounding so hard my ears were ringing, but I kept going. Soon the other leg followed, and I found myself on the other side. The ground on this side felt cold, damp, and almost alien. That's it, I muttered, looking at the forest. The trees stood motionless, their shadows dancing from the slight breeze. Max, where are you? The only response was the same silence, but I took the first step. The leaves crunched under my feet, the sound seeming deafening in the eerie silence. And yet I went forward. Because despite the fear, despite the voice in my head, I knew one thing. I couldn't lose Max. He was the only one who saw me for who I really was. And I was going to find him, no matter what it took. The forest enveloped me like a thick fog, blocking out all sounds except the crunch of my steps and the pounding of my heart in my ears. With each step, it grew denser, the trees towering higher, their branches intertwining, blocking the path. This was the forest of my past, and I could feel it trying to grab me, to hold me where I had always been afraid to be. Max, I called again, but the sound of my voice was muffled by the eerie silence. I looked around, clutching at the slightest sign of his presence. It was a futile hope, but it kept me from turning back and running away. My gaze caught scattered branches, fresh paw prints on the damp ground, and it made me move forward. But each step became harder. Memories began to surface from the depths of my consciousness, like long-buried secrets I had tried to forget. 7 years ago, this forest seemed almost magical to me. Sophie and I often came here to walk. She was my cousin, almost a sister. We were always together. She was bright, brave, leading the way, and I was her shadow, quiet and ready to follow her anywhere. Come on, Carla, just jump, she shouted then, standing on a fallen tree that hung over a small ravine. She balanced on it with a grace that always made me envious. I can't, I said, standing behind her, trembling with fear. It's too high. Of course you can. She turned and smiled, always more confident in my abilities than I was. If I can do it, so can you. I remember taking a step, feeling the ground beneath my feet become unsteady, and at that moment, everything went wrong. The branches cracked. Sophie screamed. And then, silence. I shook my head trying to get rid of the memory, but it clung to me like thorns from a bush. I knew this place would bring it all back, every detail, every emotion. This forest was more than just trees and shadows. It was my mirror, showing me everything I had been avoiding. Max! I shouted louder, almost breaking my voice. And then it happened. A sound. Faint, barely audible whimpering, somewhere in the distance. My heart skipped a beat and I froze, listening. It was him. I was sure of it. I'm coming, buddy, I shouted, and my feet carried me forward, the crunch of branches and wet mud no longer mattering. But the forest wasn't going to let me go so easily. Branches grabbed at my clothes like claws. Wet grass slowed my steps. And then I saw it. In front of me on the ground lay his collar. Orange with a metal ring, the one I had chosen for him so he would be more visible in such places. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. There was blood on the collar. Not much, just drops. But it was enough to send a cold panic through me. No, 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 I whispered, clutching the collar so tightly that my nails dug into my skin. I began to look around, hoping to find tracks, anything that would tell me where he had gone. And then I heard a rustle behind me. I turned so quickly I almost lost my balance. Max? My voice trembled. But it wasn't Max. In the bushes, a shadow flashed. A figure, tall, dark, elusive. I tensed, ready for anything, but the next moment it disappeared, as if dissolving into the air. Hey, I shouted, but no one answered. Was it real? Or was my mind playing a cruel trick on me, reminding me that I had never been strong? I took a step forward, still clutching the collar in my hand, and swore to myself that I wouldn't give up. Max was out there somewhere, and I wouldn't let this place, or my past, break me. Max? I called out again, but the sound was lost in the silence. I stood there, clutching his bloodied collar in my hands. Each second felt like an eternity. Thoughts raced through my mind. Where is he? What happened to him? Where did the blood come from? And most importantly, what was that shadow I saw? It's just your imagination, I muttered to myself, trying to regain a sense of reality. You're scared, that's all. But convincing myself was hard. I knew the forest was bringing my fears to life, making me see what I had tried to bury. A step. Another rustle. Closer this time. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind. Someone was there. I turned slowly, so slowly that a cold shiver ran down the back of my neck. And again, nothing. Damn it, Max. I exhaled, feeling my anxiety turn into anger. If you can hear me, you'd better come running. But he didn't come running, and I kept walking, clutching the collar tighter to my chest. Branches crunched under my feet, shadows thickened. The air grew heavier, denser. It felt like the forest knew I was there and didn't want to let me go. After a few minutes, I saw something ahead. A path I didn't remember. It wound between the trees, narrow, barely visible as if deliberately hidden. Under any other circumstances, I would have ignored it, but now I had no choice. I hope you're there, buddy, I muttered, taking the first step onto the path. Did you lose something? A sudden voice pierced the silence, making me scream. I spun around but saw no one, only shadows. A muffled laugh came from the forest, echoing off the trees. Who's there? I shouted, feeling my heart pounding in my throat. There was no answer, only the crunch of branches to the left. I turned toward the sound but didn't take a step. Something told me that moving now was not the best idea. Max? Is that you? My voice trembled. Again, silence, but then steps. Closer this time. And finally, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man. Tall, with a gaunt face, clothes stained with dirt, and a flashlight in his hand, the light pointed right at my eyes. Hey, what are you doing here? He asked sharply, squinting to get a better look at me. My dog. He ran in here. I'm looking for him, I replied, trying to sound confident, though my legs were shaking. And you? The man didn't answer right away. His gaze slid down to the collar I was clutching in my hands. You know, this forest isn't a place for walks. Especially not now, he said, ignoring my question. People get lost here, dogs too. What do you mean? I took a step back, instinctively distancing myself from him. Have you seen my dog? Maybe, he drawled, and there was something strange drawn out in his voice. Big dog, Golden, right? Yes. Have you seen him? Where is he? I stepped forward, suddenly filled with hope. But the man just smirked, stepping to the side. He went further down the path. But you shouldn't go there. The forest keeps those who venture too far. I clutched the collar tighter, feeling anger rise in my chest. I don't care what the forest keeps. I have to find him. Then good luck, he said, turning his back to me. But remember, the forest takes what it needs. Before I could ask what he meant, he disappeared, as if dissolving among the trees. Only the faint light of the flashlight flickered in the distance, and then it was gone. I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was he? Why did his words sound like he knew more than he was saying? And why did he look like he had spent many years in this forest? Max, I called softly, feeling the fear rise within me again. But I had come too far to turn back. The path beckoned me forward, deepening the darkness around me. I took a step, then another, and I knew I had to keep going, even if every movement was a struggle. Max was out there somewhere. And if the forest really took what it needed, it wouldn't get me. Or my dog. The forest grew even denser. The trees, intertwined with branches, almost completely hid the sky. Only a faint light filtered through their gnarled arms, creating patches and shadows on the ground that seemed to move on their own. My feet slipped on the wet ground. Branches scratched my arms. But I kept going, clutching Max's collar tighter. Each step deepened the sense of unease. I tried to convince myself that this was just a forest, a place that couldn't harm me on its own. But with each step, it felt like the trees were watching me, as if the forest really had eyes. And at the same time, Sophie's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that I wasn't here by accident. "You knew you'd come back here," her voice said, soft as the whisper of the wind. "You were just waiting for a reason." "I wasn't waiting for anything," I replied, even though I knew I was talking to the void. "If Max hadn't jumped over that damn fence, I wouldn't be here." But her voice continued. "Or maybe he made you come? Maybe the forest has been pulling you all this time?" I stopped abruptly, taking a deep breath, trying to suppress this internal dialogue. It wasn't true. I was here only for Max. No ancient fears or secrets of the forest mattered. And then I heard it again. Faint, but distinct. A short, pained whine. My heart leaped and I ran forward, forgetting everything but him. "Max, I'm coming, buddy. Hold on." The sound grew louder, more distinct, but with each step, the forest seemed to resist me. Branches grabbed at my clothes, wet ground slowed my steps. At one point, I stumbled and fell, but getting up, I kept going. And then I emerged into a small clearing. Here, the shadows retreated, the trees parted, revealing a circle of light. In the center of the clearing lay Max. His golden fur was matted with dirt. His back leg looked twisted, and there was blood on his side. "Max!" My voice trembled as I rushed to him. I knelt down, carefully running my hands over his body. "You scared me to death, buddy." He lifted his head and licked my face, his eyes full of trust, looking at me as if all he needed was my presence. I quickly checked his leg. It was dislocated, not broken. The blood came from a small wound on his side, not fatal, but still frightening. "We'll get out of here," I said, trying to sound firm. "I'll get you out." I had just started to lift him when I felt something move behind me. The sound was too faint to be an animal rustling, too loud to be just the wind. I turned, holding on to Max. In the shadows of the trees stood the same man I had seen earlier. His face was hidden under a hood, but the flashlight in his hand still shone. "You found him," he said calmly, as if he had been watching me the whole time. "What are you doing here?" I blurted out, clutching Max to me. "Why are you following me?" He didn't move, only slightly tilted his head. "I'm here to make sure the forest lets you go. But be careful. It takes a toll on everyone who leaves." "What are you talking about? It's just a forest," I almost shouted, but he just smiled. "Maybe," he said, then stepped back into the shadows. Or maybe not. I stood there, confused and gripped by fear as he disappeared. Then I looked at Max again. His eyes looked at me with complete trust. I knew I had to get him out, no matter what it cost. I lifted Max into my arms, his weight heavier than I expected. But I moved forward, back along the same path. Each step was a struggle. The forest thickened again. The trees hid the light. But now I felt like someone, or something, was watching me. And I knew. This place wouldn't let me go without a fight. My feet buckled with exhaustion as I made my way back through the forest, carrying Max in my arms. His weight was heavy, but much heavier was the silence around us. It seemed like the forest had fallen silent, watching every step I took, as if it was waiting for me to make a mistake. Every now and then, Max let out a soft whine, making me hold him tighter. "It's going to be okay," I whispered to him, but the words were meant for myself as well. "We're almost out." Each step forward felt like a battle, And this battle was not just with the forest, but with what it awakened in me. I could feel the past catching up to me, Sophie's shadows following every move I made. "Do you really think you deserve to get out?" A voice whispered from the depths of my consciousness. I stopped. That voice wasn't mine. It belonged to her, Sophie, the one I had lost. I clenched my teeth, ignoring it. The forest was playing with me. It knew how to get to me. "You didn't save me." The voice grew louder, closer. "Why do you think you can save him?" I turned sharply, expecting to see something. Someone. But there were only trees, motionless, ancient, just the forest. I held Max tighter. He whimpered softly, as if sensing my tension. "It was an accident," I whispered, more to myself than to anyone. I couldn't do anything. But the forest, it seemed, disagreed. The trees with their gnarled branches, which reached out like arms, created patterns that looked like faces. Faces that looked at me with silent judgment. I walked on, not paying attention to the pain in my muscles, to the dark thoughts that seemed to dig into my head. But the path in front of me began to change. It became narrow, then disappeared altogether, only to reappear again, but in a different direction. It seemed like the forest was trying to confuse me. "Not today," I muttered, holding Max tighter. "You won't get us." I remembered the words of that strange man. The forest takes what it needs. But what did it want to take? Me? Max? Or something more? The path in front of me opened up, revealing a small clearing bathed in moonlight. In its center lay something that made me freeze. It was a familiar scarf, white with blue flowers. The same one Sophie wore that day, 7 years ago. My fingers trembled as I reached for it. It was real, the fabric still soft to the touch. The forest knew how to keep me in its grasp. "Enough," I said loudly, not caring if anyone heard me. "You won't get me. I'm not afraid of you anymore." The words sounded hollow, but I felt something shift with them. The air around me grew lighter, and I heard a faint but familiar sound. Max's clear bark. I looked at him. His eyes opened and his tail twitched slightly. He looked at me as if saying, "You can do this." "Yes, I can," I breathed, lifting him again. "We can do this." I moved forward and the forest began to retreat. The trees no longer seemed so menacing. Their branches no longer reached for me. Ahead, I saw a faint light. It was the way out. The fence, my home. They were closer than I thought. When I finally emerged from the forest, my legs gave way, and I sank to the ground, gently laying Max down. I was exhausted, but a wave of relief washed over me. The forest was behind me. Max lifted his head and barked softly, his tail wagging slowly. "You did good, buddy," I said, stroking his head. "You made it." But at that moment, I realized that it was he who had helped me make it. Max had led me into the forest, not by chance. He had made me return to where I had left a part of myself, so I could find myself again. I looked at the forest, at the dark wall of trees that now seemed smaller. It no longer frightened me. It was just a forest. But it had been my test. I knew I would never be the same again. Max sighed heavily, settling down next to me, and I felt the inner world that had been torn apart 7 years ago beginning to piece itself back together.